April 11, 1945. The USS Enterprise, the most decorated ship in the United States Navy, steamed 70 miles off Okinawa when the lookout's voice shattered the afternoon calm. "Bogey inbound, bearing 030. Men looked up to see a single Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter screaming down through broken clouds at 300 miles per hour, its engine howling like a tortured demon. There was no time to think, barely time to breathe. Anti-aircraft guns erupted in a desperate barrage, tracers arcing skyward. But the Kamikaze pilot held his course with fanatical precision. At 2:08 p.m., he plunged into the carrier's forward flight deck in a cataclysm of fire and twisted steel. The explosion ripped through 3 decks, instantly killing 14 sailors and igniting aviation fuel that transformed the hangar bay into an inferno. Smoke poured from the massive wound as flames licked at bomb-laden aircraft. The Enterprise, survivor of nearly every major Pacific battle, now faced her deadliest enemy, herself. Thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline, hundreds of bombs and rockets, all threatened to detonate in a chain reaction that would tear the ship apart from within. As damage control teams rushed toward the chaos, officers assessed the nightmare scenario unfolding before them. The carrier was dying, and conventional methods might not save her. What happened next would defy every regulation in naval doctrine. One sailor, a kid from Iowa whose name would be lost to history, proposed an idea so absurd his commanding officer called it idiotic. Yet in 3 desperate hours, that ridiculous idea would become the difference between Enterprise sailing home and Enterprise resting on the ocean floor. This is the story of how unorthodox thinking, raw courage, and a simple bucket saved America's most legendary warship when everything else failed. By 1945, kamikaze attacks had become Japan's most potent naval weapon, a terrifying fusion of aircraft and suicide bomber that turned young pilots into guided missiles. American carriers, the crown jewels of Pacific naval power, were their prime targets. When one of those human bombs found its mark, the result was catastrophic damage that pushed damage control teams beyond the limits of their training. The Enterprise was about to discover just how thin the line between survival and annihilation truly was, and one sailor's willingness to think differently would make all the difference. To understand the terror that gripped every sailor in the Pacific by 1945, you need to understand what made kamikaze attacks fundamentally different from conventional warfare. This wasn't just another weapon. It was a paradigm shift that turned human beings into precision-guided munitions decades before smart bombs existed. And the numbers tell a chilling story about just how effective this desperate strategy actually was. The Kamikaze Corps, officially named the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogeki-tai, or Divine Wind Special Attack Units, emerged in October 1944 as Japan faced inevitable defeat. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi conceived the tactic out of brutal mathematical reality. Japanese pilots were dying at staggering rates while inflicting minimal damage on the American fleet. Conventional attacks required pilots to release bombs or torpedoes, then escape through walls of anti-aircraft fire, with success rates below 5%. But a pilot willing to die, guiding his aircraft directly into the target, had a dramatically higher probability of scoring a hit. It was a horrifying calculus that traded lives for certainty. The statistics justify the terror these attacks inspired. Between October 1944 and August 1945, kamikaze pilots flew approximately 3,860 suicide missions. They sank 34 American naval vessels and damaged 368 others, a hit rate of roughly 19%, nearly 4 times higher than conventional attacks. Even more sobering, kamikaze strikes accounted for 48% of all American ships sunk during this period, despite representing only a fraction of total Japanese air operations. These weren't wild, desperate charges by untrained fanatics. These were calculated attacks by pilots with just enough training to reach their targets. Flying aircraft transformed into manned cruise missiles. The Japanese employed virtually every aircraft type in their arsenal for kamikaze missions, from obsolete trainers to frontline fighters. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the legendary fighter that had dominated the Pacific's early years, became a common kamikaze platform when its performance advantages evaporated against newer American aircraft. The Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bomber, capable of 360 miles per hour, proved particularly deadly due to its speed and diving characteristics. Even the slow, obsolete Yokosuka K5Y Willow biplane trainer was pressed into service, proving that velocity mattered less than determination when your aircraft was the warhead. American carriers represented the ultimate prize for kamikaze pilots. These floating cities projected American air power across the Pacific, enabling the island-hopping campaign that pushed inexorably toward Japan's home islands. Sink or cripple a carrier, and you remove 100 aircraft from the battle, strand thousands of sailors, and potentially shift strategic momentum. The Japanese High Command understood that carriers were both militarily critical and psychologically devastating targets. Their loss would resonate through American war councils and potentially onto front pages back home. But carriers presented another advantage for kamikaze tactics. They were catastrophically vulnerable. Unlike battleships with thick armor belts and heavily protected vitals, carriers were essentially giant fuel tanks wrapped around floating ammunition dumps. Their flight decks, necessarily unarmored to minimize weight, offered minimal protection against plunging aircraft. Below those decks sat thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline, bombs, rockets, and ammunition, all the explosive materials needed to sustain air operations. A kamikaze penetrating this environment didn't just damage the ship. It ignited an internal apocalypse. The hangar bays became blast furnaces, fuel lines ruptured into rivers of fire, and ammunition cooked off in chain reactions that could tear a carrier apart from within. By spring 1945, Japan's desperation had reached its zenith. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. The Philippines were lost, and American forces now stood at Okinawa's doorstep, just 350 miles from Japan's home islands. Conventional air power couldn't stop the American advance. Japan simply lacked the pilots, fuel, and aircraft to contest American air superiority. Kamikaze attacks represented more than military tactics. They embodied a nation's willingness to sacrifice everything in a final apocalyptic defense. Over 1,900 kamikaze sorties would be launched during the Okinawa campaign alone, the largest and most sustained suicide attack in military history. For American sailors, this created a unique psychological burden. Traditional combat offered hope. Evade, survive, fight another day. Kamikaze warfare eliminated that equation. The pilot diving toward your ship wasn't trying to survive, he was already dead. A ghost flying a bomb. Anti-aircraft fire might shred his aircraft, but momentum and gravity would carry tons of metal, fuel, and explosives into your ship regardless. Every dot on the horizon became a potential death sentence. Sleep became difficult. Nerves frayed. And when that screaming engine finally broke through the defensive fire, when you saw the rising sun insignia growing larger, you faced the terrible knowledge that someone had chosen your ship to die destroying. That's the environment Enterprise sailed into on April 11, 1945. A killing field where death flew at you with human determination behind the controls. The Zero struck Enterprise's forward flight deck 25 feet from the center line, punching through the wooden planking like a fist through cardboard. The impact point, directly over the forward elevator, was catastrophically chosen, whether by skill or terrible luck. The aircraft's engine, still spinning at full throttle, penetrated the flight deck and plummeted through the gallery deck below, before finally stopping in the second deck. Behind it, 250 pounds of explosives, and nearly 200 gallons of aviation fuel detonated in a confined space, creating an overpressure wave that shattered everything within a 60-foot radius. The blast ripped through berthing compartments where off-duty sailors slept, through passageways where men rushed to battle stations, through electrical trunking and ventilation shafts that carried the explosion's fury deep into the ship's vitals. 14 men died instantly, vaporized by the blast or crushed by collapsing steel. Another 68 suffered burns, lacerations, and blast injuries severe enough to overwhelm the medical spaces. But the human cost, horrific as it was, represented only the beginning of Enterprise's crisis. The structural damage threatened to kill everyone aboard. The forward elevator, a massive platform designed to lift fully loaded aircraft between the hangar and flight deck, had been blown completely off its mountings. 30 tons of steel machinery now hung at a grotesque angle, jammed halfway between decks, creating a 3-story wound open to the sky. Seawater and burning aviation fuel poured through this gap, while wind-driven flames spread in every direction. The elevator well acted as a chimney, feeding fresh oxygen to fires below and creating a blowtorch effect that heated steel bulkheads to glowing red. In the hangar bay, directly beneath the impact point, 18 aircraft sat fully fueled and armed for the next strike mission. The Kamikaze's burning fuel had splashed across 4 of them, igniting their own fuel tanks in sympathetic explosions. A Grumman F-6F Hellcat exploded, sending fragments of aluminum and steel scything through the enclosed space. Its .50 caliber ammunition cooked off in streams of tracer fire that ricocheted wildly, igniting more fuel, puncturing more aircraft. 2 torpedoes, each carrying 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, sat mounted beneath TBF Avengers just 40 feet from the flames. If those torpedoes detonated, they would gut Enterprise below the waterline, breaking her keel and sending her to the bottom in minutes. The fire suppression systems, Enterprise's first line of defense, had been severed by the blast. Sprinkler heads in the hangar bay hung uselessly dry. The pipes feeding them had been sheared through 3 decks up. Fire mains, the high-pressure salt water lines that supplied hoses throughout the ship, had ruptured in multiple locations, flooding some compartments while denying water to the spaces that desperately needed it. Damage control teams arriving with hoses found only a weak dribble when they needed a torrent. Simultaneously, flooding threatened the ship's stability. The explosion had ruptured the hull below the waterline in 2 locations, allowing the sea to pour into fuel storage tanks and equipment spaces on the starboard side. Water accumulated with terrifying speed, hundreds of tons in the first 10 minutes, creating an asymmetric load that caused Enterprise to develop a 5-degree list to starboard. In isolation, 5 degrees sounds manageable, but a carrier listing means aircraft slide across the flight deck, equipment breaks loose in the hangar bay, and firefighting becomes exponentially harder. More critically, continued flooding would increase the list past the point of no return. Beyond 12 degrees, stability calculations showed Enterprise would capsize, rolling over to trap thousands of men in darkness and drowning. The electrical situation compounded every other crisis. The blast had severed primary power cables, plunging entire sections of the ship into darkness. Emergency lighting failed to activate in several spaces where battery connections had shaken loose. Ventilation systems stopped, turning compartments below decks into suffocating boxes filled with toxic smoke. The ship's interior communications, the sound-powered phone system that allowed damage control central to coordinate responses, worked sporadically at best. Officers shouted orders that never reached their intended recipients. Damage reports arrived minutes late or not at all. The Enterprise had been partially blinded, deafened, and paralyzed. Forward fire rooms, the boiler spaces that generated steam for the ship's propulsion, reported smoke infiltration and rising temperatures. If fire reached these spaces, or if flooding contaminated the boiler feed water, Enterprise would lose propulsion, becoming a drifting tomb vulnerable to follow-up kamikaze attacks. Okinawa was 70 miles away, but it might as well have been 700 if the engines stopped. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Grover B.H. Hall, received reports from Damage Control Central that painted a nightmare picture. Uncontrolled fires in the hangar bay with armed ordnance directly threatened. Flooding increasing below the waterline. List developing with no counter-flooding capability due to ruptured systems. Fire suppression compromised. Communications failing. The traditional damage control playbook, pump out the water, contain the fires, shore up weakened structures, assumed your systems worked. But Enterprise's systems were shattered. Pumps couldn't reach the flooded spaces. Fire hoses couldn't deliver water. Counter-flooding valves couldn't be opened remotely, and accessing them manually meant sending men into pitch black, flooded compartments filling with seawater. 3 separate catastrophic scenarios raced toward simultaneous conclusion. The ship could capsize from progressive flooding, explode from ordnance detonation in the hangar bay, or burn through critical structures until the forward section collapsed entirely. Any one of these would be fatal. All 3 were developing at once, and standing on the bridge, watching smoke pour from the wound in his ship's deck, Captain Hall knew they had perhaps 90 minutes before one of those scenarios reached its irreversible conclusion. The Enterprise, survivor of Santa Cruz, Eastern Solomons, Philippine Sea, and a dozen other desperate battles, now fought her most critical engagement not against an external enemy, but against the physics of fire, water, and structural failure consuming her from within. The United States Navy entered World War II with a revolutionary philosophy that set it apart from every other naval power. The ship's company doesn't just fight the enemy, they fight for the ship's survival. This wasn't rhetoric. It was doctrine, drilled into every sailor from the moment he reported aboard. Save the ship was more than a motto. It was an operational imperative backed by training, equipment, and organizational culture that would prove decisive in the Pacific's brutal carrier battles. American damage control doctrine rested on 3 foundational principles: compartmentalization, redundancy, and crew empowerment. Compartmentalization meant dividing the ship into hundreds of watertight spaces, separated by steel doors and hatches. Flooding in one compartment could be isolated, preventing progressive flooding that would sink the ship. Critical systems, electrical, propulsion, communications, ran through multiple parallel paths, so damage to one wouldn't cripple the entire vessel. Fire suppression systems covered every space with automatic sprinklers, foam generators, and high-pressure water mains. Every sailor, regardless of rating or specialty, received basic damage control training. Cooks fought fires. Clerks plugged holes. Radiomen carried stretchers. The entire crew became a distributed damage control organization. This approach was formalized through repair parties, specialized teams stationed throughout the ship, each responsible for a specific zone. Enterprise had 8 repair parties, each commanded by an officer and staffed with specialists. Ship fitters with welding equipment, electricians to restore power, firefighters trained in chemical fires, corpsmen to treat casualties. Repair Party 5 covered the forward hangar bay, exactly where the Kamikaze had struck. When general quarters sounded, these men reported to their stations with portable pumps, welding gear, shoring timbers, and firefighting equipment. Their doctrine was straightforward: assess damage, contain fires, control flooding, restore systems. Speed mattered, but methodology mattered more. Follow the checklist, execute the procedures, and the ship survives. The Navy's confidence in these methods came from harsh lessons learned by others, particularly the Japanese. At Midway in June 1942, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed in a single day. Not because American bombs were extraordinarily powerful, but because Japanese damage control was catastrophically inadequate. Japanese carrier design prioritized offensive capability over survivability. They lacked compartmentalization, featured inadequate fire suppression systems, and concentrated damage control responsibility in small specialist teams rather than training the entire crew. When American dive bombers struck those carriers with their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, fires spread uncontrollably. Damage control parties, overwhelmed and undersized, couldn't contain the blazes. Aviation fuel ignited, ordnance exploded, and all four carriers burned to their waterlines within hours. American carriers incorporated those lessons obsessively. Enhanced compartmentalization, improved firefighting equipment, fog foam systems to blanket fuel fires, and most critically, comprehensive crew training that made every sailor a potential damage control responder. The contrast was stark. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, Enterprise absorbed 3 bomb hits and remained operational. At Eastern Solomons, she took a bomb that penetrated 3 decks and kept fighting. American carriers could absorb punishment that would destroy their Japanese counterparts because their crews knew how to save their ships. But doctrine assumes your systems function. The procedures in the damage control manual presumed working fire mains, operational pumps, intact communications, and accessible compartments. Repair Party 5's standard response to hangar bay fires called for activating overhead sprinklers, deploying fog foam applicators, and using multiple fire hoses to create overlapping water curtains that would contain the flames, while teams in firefighting gear entered to extinguish remaining hot spots. For flooding, the procedure was equally systematic. Identify the breach, establish pumping operations, counter-flood opposite compartments to correct any list, and send divers or hull technicians to patch the damage from outside if necessary. These methods worked brilliantly when the infrastructure survived. But aboard Enterprise on April 11th, the infrastructure was shattered. Sprinklers didn't spray. Fire mains delivered trickles instead of torrents. Pumps couldn't reach flooded spaces. The playbook that had saved Enterprise through dozens of engagements suddenly offered solutions that couldn't be executed. Repair Party 5 faced a hellish equation. They had the training, they had the courage, they understood the procedures, but they lacked the functioning systems to implement them. The doctrine demanded they contain fires and control flooding simultaneously. But how do you fight fires without water pressure? How do you pump out flooded compartments when your pumps can't access them? How do you counterflood to correct a worsening list when the valves won't open? This was the crucible moment where training met reality's harsh limitations. The men of Repair Party 5, their faces blackened by smoke and their uniforms soaked with salt water and sweat, stared at an inferno their conventional tools couldn't suppress, and flooding their standard equipment couldn't control. The manual had no answer for this scenario. The training had prepared them for damaged systems, not systematically destroyed infrastructure. They needed something the Navy hadn't taught them, something that wasn't in the damage control handbook, something that violated every procedure they'd memorized. They needed someone willing to abandon the playbook entirely and improvise a solution from whatever remained. That's when a young sailor, exhausted and desperate, looked at the tools they still possessed and proposed an idea so fundamentally unorthodox, his officer's first response was to call it idiotic. His name has been lost to history. Buried in after-action reports that focused on officers and statistics rather than individual enlisted ingenuity. We know he was young, probably 19 or 20. We know he was assigned to Repair Party 5. Some accounts suggest he was a fireman's apprentice from the Midwest, possibly Iowa or Nebraska, one of thousands of farm boys who traded cornfields for flight decks. For the purposes of this story, we'll call him what his shipmates likely did: Johnson, or Miller, or Smith, one of those common surnames that made up America's wartime Navy. What matters isn't his name. What matters is that when every system failed and death seemed inevitable, he saw a solution that everyone else dismissed as absurd. The specific problem was uniquely intractable. The Kamikaze impact had ruptured fuel tanks and seawater intake lines in a compartment 3 decks below the hangar bay, a critical space containing electrical switchboards and auxiliary machinery. Seawater poured in through the hull breach while aviation fuel leaked from above, creating a toxic, flammable mixture that rose inch by terrifying inch. This compartment had to be saved. It housed backup generators needed to restore lighting and ventilation, and more critically, it contained damage control equipment, including portable pumps that could address flooding elsewhere in the ship. Lose this space, and the cascading failures would accelerate beyond any hope of recovery. Standard procedure was straightforward. Deploy portable pumps to remove the water faster than it entered, then send repair teams to patch the breach. But the pumps required electrical power, and the explosion had severed power cables to this section. Battery-powered emergency pumps existed, but they'd been stored in a flooded compartment and were unreachable. The diesel-powered portable pumps, the backup to the backup, couldn't be brought down 3 decks through smoke-filled passageways choked with debris and damaged ladders. Every conventional solution ran into the same wall. The tools they needed were inaccessible or non-functional. Meanwhile, the water rose. 6 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches. Within 30 minutes, it would reach the electrical panels, causing shorts that would spark and potentially ignite the fuel-contaminated water in a confined space explosion that would kill anyone nearby and eliminate any chance of saving the compartment. Lieutenant Morrison, the Repair Party 5 officer, stood at the compartment entrance watching the waterline creep upward, mentally cycling through options that all ended in failure. His men waited for orders, their faces reflecting the same helpless frustration. They had training, courage, and determination, everything except a way to remove several tons of contaminated water without pumps. That's when the young sailor spoke up. "Sir, what if we just bail it out?" "Like a boat." "Buckets, sir. A bucket brigade." The suggestion landed like a stone in water. Silence. Then someone laughed, a short, incredulous bark. Lieutenant Morrison turned, his expression somewhere between disbelief and anger. "Buckets? Son, there are thousands of gallons of water down there. This isn't a leaky rowboat. This is a flooding compartment on a goddamn aircraft carrier." But the sailor pressed on, his voice gaining confidence even as his hands shook. "Sir, we've got maybe 300 men within 200 feet of this space. Most of them are standing around because their equipment doesn't work or can't get here. A man can carry a 5-gallon bucket, fill it, pass it up the ladder, dump it overboard, send the empty back down. It's manual, it's slow, but it's something we can do right now. We don't need power. We don't need equipment we can't reach. We just need bodies and buckets." Morrison stared at him. Around them, the ship groaned and shuddered, punctuated by distant explosions from the hangar bay. The proposal violated everything Morrison had been taught about modern naval damage control. Bucket brigades belonged to the age of wooden ships and iron men, not fleet carriers with sophisticated firefighting systems. The idea seemed almost insulting, reducing cutting-edge naval engineering to medieval labor. It was primitive, inefficient, and utterly beneath the dignity of the United States Navy's damage control doctrine. "It's idiotic," Morrison said flatly. "We'd need hundreds of buckets we don't have, coordinate hundreds of men in smoke and darkness, and even then we probably can't bail faster than it's flooding. You're talking about exhausting the entire crew on something that might not even work." The sailor didn't back down. His face was smudged with soot, his uniform torn, but his eyes held steady. "Sir, with respect, nothing else is working. The pumps are gone. The equipment's gone. But we've got buckets in the galley, the machine shops, the fire stations. We've got men standing idle because their systems are blown to hell. Maybe it's stupid. Maybe we can't bail fast enough. But right now, we're doing nothing. And in 20 minutes, that compartment floods completely, and we lose any chance of saving the ship." I'd rather die trying something idiotic than doing nothing at all. Morrison looked at the rising water, then at his men, then back at the sailor. The mathematics were daunting. Even if they assembled 200 men into a bucket brigade, even if each man moved 5 gallons every minute, an exhausting pace impossible to sustain, they'd remove only 1,000 gallons every minute. The compartment was flooding at an estimated rate of 800 gallons per minute. The margin was razor thin, assuming everything went perfectly, which nothing had gone perfectly for the last 40 minutes. But the sailor was right about one thing. They were doing nothing. Every alternative required equipment they didn't have or time they'd already lost. A bucket brigade was ridiculous, primitive, and humiliating. It was also the only option that didn't require anything they lacked. They had buckets. They had men. They had hands and backs and stubborn determination. Morrison made the decision that would define his career and possibly save 2,000 lives. Fine. It's the stupidest idea I've ever approved, but fine. Round up every bucket, trash can, and container on this ship. Get me 200 men right now. We're going to bail out a goddamn aircraft carrier like it's a fishing dinghy. And God help us if this doesn't work. The sailor, this nameless young man who'd proposed rejecting modern doctrine in favor of ancient manual labor, allowed himself the smallest smile despite the smoke and chaos and terror surrounding them. Aye, aye, sir. And sir, it'll work. It has to. Because the alternative was sinking, and nobody aboard Enterprise was ready to accept that fate. Not while they could still lift a bucket. Not while they could still fight. The call went out across every functional communication circuit aboard Enterprise. All hands not engaged in firefighting or critical operations. Muster at frame 52, starboard side. Bring any container that holds water. Repeat. Buckets, trash cans, anything. Move now. Within 3 minutes, men began arriving from every corner of the ship. Engine room personnel still wearing oil-stained coveralls. Cooks abandoning their galley. Clerks from the ship's office. Aircraft mechanics who'd been waiting topside for orders that never came. They carried an absurd collection of containers, proper fire buckets painted red, galvanized steel trash cans, cooking pots large enough to boil soup for 50 men, even empty shell casings from 5-inch guns. Someone produced a wooden crate that had held ammunition. Another sailor appeared with a canvas bag normally used for mail. If it could hold water for the 30 seconds required to move it up 3 decks and dump it overboard, it became part of the brigade. Lieutenant Morrison organized the chaos with the efficiency of a factory foreman. He stationed men every 8 feet along the route from the flooding compartment to the nearest open deck edge, a distance of roughly 120 feet, requiring 15 positions. The mathematics were simple. Fill at the bottom, pass up the chain, dump over the side, return empties down the opposite side of the passageway. Gravity would help with the loaded buckets going up. Exhaustion would fight them the entire way. "You work in shifts," Morrison shouted over the ambient roar of fires and damage control operations. 5 minutes on, 2 minutes rest. When you can't lift anymore, tap out and let fresh men rotate in. Nobody plays hero. Nobody collapses from exhaustion. We need sustainable effort, not sprints. The first man descended into the compartment wearing a breathing apparatus, waist deep in the contaminated water that sloshed with the ship's motion. The fumes were overwhelming, a nauseating mixture of fuel oil, seawater, and something chemical he couldn't identify. His job was simple and brutal. Fill buckets as fast as humanly possible, hand them to the man at the ladder base. Repeat until his arms gave out. He plunged the first bucket into the dark water, felt the weight multiply as it filled, and heaved it toward the ladder. The second man grabbed it, turned, passed it to the third. The bucket moved up the chain, hand to hand to hand. A relay race where the prize was survival. Within 60 seconds, the first bucket reached topside, and a sailor hurled its contents over the rail into the Pacific. 5 gallons gone. Several thousand remained. The empty bucket started its return journey, moving faster downhill, back to the man in the water who was already extending a full bucket to the ladder. The second bucket made the journey. Then the third. A rhythm began to establish itself, rough and uneven at first, but gradually synchronizing as men learned to anticipate the timing, to position themselves for the handoff, to use their legs instead of just their arms to lift the weight. But rhythm didn't mean easy. Each 5-gallon bucket weighed 42 pounds when full. The men were passing these weights hand to hand every 15 to 20 seconds, a pace that turned shoulders into fire and forearms into knots of screaming muscle within the first 5 minutes. Sailors who'd seemed fresh and strong at the start began to tremble by minute 4, their hands shaking as they reached for the next bucket. Morrison enforced the rotation ruthlessly. When a man's grip faltered, when buckets started to slip, he was pulled out, and a fresh sailor stepped in. The queue of waiting men stretched down the passageway, each one watching the clock, knowing his turn approached, dreading it and accepting it simultaneously. The ship fought them at every step. Enterprise had developed a 7-degree list now, making the upward passage a slanted climb, where footing was treacherous and balance precarious. Smoke from the hangar bay fires drifted through ventilation shafts and open hatches, reducing visibility to arm's length in some sections. Men passed buckets to shadows, trusting that hands would be there to receive them. The heat was suffocating, not just from fires, but from hundreds of men laboring in confined spaces, their exertion raising the ambient temperature until sweat poured off every face and soaked through every uniform. Breathing became work. Every inhalation brought smoke-tinged air that burned throats and lungs. Then, the explosions started. In the hangar bay forward, ammunition cooked off in staccato bursts that sent shrapnel pinging off bulkheads. Each detonation caused the bucket brigade to freeze momentarily, men flinching, waiting to see if this was the big one, the sympathetic explosion that would detonate torpedoes and blow the ship apart. When nothing catastrophic followed, they resumed, hands reaching for buckets with even greater urgency because those explosions meant time was running out. A sailor near the top of the ladder missed his grip. A full bucket tumbled backward, striking the man below in the chest and drenching 3 others in contaminated water. Men cursed, coughed, wiped fuel from their faces. Nobody stopped. The empty bucket was recovered, sent back down, and the rhythm resumed within seconds. Injuries were inevitable and ignored unless incapacitating. Backs strained, fingers were pinched between bucket handles, men slipped on wet decks and caught themselves at the last second. A young seaman vomited from exertion and fumes, wiped his mouth and kept working. Another collapsed after 6 minutes at the filling position, hauled out by his arms while his replacement splashed into position without missing a beat. Morrison monitored the water level obsessively, marking the bulkhead with chalk every 2 minutes. The progress was maddeningly slow. After 10 minutes of furious effort, the water had dropped perhaps 2 inches. 2 inches purchased with the exhaustion of 40 men and the movement of approximately 2,000 gallons. But 2 inches meant the electrical panels remained dry. 2 inches meant they were winning, barely, against the incoming flood. The question was whether they could sustain this pace long enough to actually clear the compartment before the men collapsed, or the ship's other crises overtook them. In the passageways, a strange culture emerged among the brigade. Men began to chant, nothing organized, just rhythmic grunts and counts that synchronized the passing. "I'll be heave, heave, heave." Someone started singing a work song, probably something his grandfather had sung. Others joined in, not because they knew the words, but because the rhythm helped, because singing meant they were still breathing, still fighting. The absurdity of it struck some men even through the exhaustion. They were saving a 20,000-ton warship with buckets and sea shanties, like sailors from another century. 20 minutes in, Morrison's chalk marks showed 6 inches of progress. They were outpacing the flooding, but not by much. The margin was perhaps 100 gallons per minute. The difference between success and failure measured in the endurance of exhausted men. Fresh sailors rotated in every 5 minutes now, but the pool of available bodies was finite. Men who'd already served their shift were being cycled back in after insufficient rest because there simply weren't enough hands. A chief petty officer appeared at Morrison's elbow, his face grim. "Sir, the hangar bay's getting worse. They need more men for firefighting." "Can you spare?" Morrison cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. "Nobody leaves this brigade until we're dry or we're sinking. Tell the hangar bay to figure it out." The chief disappeared without argument because he understood the stakes. Lose this compartment, and the cascading failures would kill them all, regardless of what happened in the hangar bay. 30 minutes. 8 inches down. The electrical panels remained dry, though the lower equipment was submerged and probably ruined. But generators could be replaced. Dead sailors couldn't. The men at the filling position were rotating every 3 minutes now because the fumes in the confined space were overwhelming even with breathing apparatus. One sailor was pulled out unconscious, overcome by vapors, carried away to medical while another splashed into position. 40 minutes. 12 inches. The incoming flood was slowing as water pressure equalized, giving the brigade a slight advantage. But the men were approaching their limits. Morrison watched a sailor near the midpoint of the chain, literally weeping from exhaustion, as he lifted each bucket, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face, his entire body trembling, but his hands still reaching. Still passing? Still fighting? That image of men pushed beyond what should be endurable but refusing to quit would stay with Morrison for the rest of his life. 50 minutes. 18 inches down. They were going to make it. The realization spread through the brigade without words. Just a subtle shift in energy. A second wind born from hope rather than adrenaline. The water level was dropping faster now, the flood reduced to a manageable stream that the brigade easily outpaced. Men who'd been moving like automatons found fresh strength. The buckets moved faster. The rhythm tightened. They weren't just bailing anymore. They were winning. 63 minutes after the first bucket descended into the flooded compartment, the water level dropped below the critical threshold. The sailor at the filling position, the seventh man to rotate through that hellish assignment, suddenly found himself standing in water barely knee-deep instead of waist-deep. He looked up at the ladder, his face streaked with grime and fuel residue, and shouted the words everyone had been desperate to hear. "We're below the breach line. The hull damage is above the water line now." The significance was immediate and profound. As long as the water level remained above the rupture point, seawater poured in continuously, fighting every bucket removed. But once the level dropped below the breach, physics became their ally. The incoming flood stopped. What remained was just standing water that the brigade could now remove without fighting a constant influx. The equation shifted from barely sustainable to decisively winnable. Lieutenant Morrison marked his bulkhead with a final chalk line and allowed himself something between a laugh and a sob. "Keep going. Empty this compartment completely, then we secure." The buckets continued their journey, but the pace eased slightly as desperation gave way to methodical completion. Men who'd been operating on adrenaline and willpower alone felt the tension drain from their shoulders. They weren't racing death anymore. They were cleaning up. The psychological shift rippled through the entire ship. In Damage Control Central, Captain Hall received the report with visible disbelief. "Say again? They bailed it out? With buckets?" When confirmation came, he permitted himself a rare smile before immediately pivoting to the next crisis. But for 60 seconds, Enterprise's commanding officer had allowed himself to believe his ship might actually survive. With the flooding controlled, Morrison deployed the portable pumps that had been waiting uselessly topside. Carried down into the now accessible compartment, diesel engines roaring to life, they began evacuating the remaining water at industrial rates. What the bucket brigade had accomplished through exhausting manual labor, the pumps finished with mechanical efficiency. Within 20 minutes, the compartment was dry enough to assess damage and begin repairs. Electricians waded through residual puddles to check switchboards, miraculously finding some equipment still functional. The backup generators, saltwater-soaked, but not submerged long enough for catastrophic damage, were stripped, cleaned, and prepared for restart. In the hangar bay, a parallel victory unfolded, with additional fire teams redirected from other spaces and Enterprise's list gradually correcting as counter-flooding operations finally became possible. Firefighters gained the upper hand against the inferno. The Avengers with their torpedo payloads had been pushed clear of the flames by men using aircraft handling equipment and sheer muscle. Fog foam, manually applied from portable containers since the overhead systems remained inoperative, blanketed burning fuel, starving fires of oxygen. The temperature began to drop. Visibility improved. The apocalyptic roar of uncontrolled combustion faded to isolated hot spots that crews systematically extinguished. By the 90-minute mark, Enterprise's list had been corrected to 3 degrees, still noticeable but no longer threatening stability. Engineering teams had restored power to critical systems using undamaged electrical routes. Lights flickered back on in spaces that had been pitch black. Ventilation systems restarted, pulling smoke from interior compartments. Communications improved as phone circuits were jury-rigged around damaged sections. The ship began to feel less like a dying organism and more like a wounded but functional warship. The forward elevator remained a twisted wreck, and the flight deck bore a gaping wound that would prevent air operations. But the hull was intact below the waterline. The fires were contained, the flooding stopped, and most critically, the cascading failures had been arrested before reaching the point of no return. Enterprise was no longer in danger of sinking or exploding. She was damaged, bloodied, diminished, but alive. Word of the Bucket Brigade's success spread through the crew with the speed of legend-making. Sailors who'd been fighting fires or manning gun positions heard about it and shook their heads in amazement. Officers gathering for a damage assessment meeting discussed it in tones mixing professional respect with genuine awe. Someone had saved the ship with buckets. It sounded like fiction, like the kind of story embellished in retelling, except hundreds of men had participated and hundreds more had witnessed it. The evidence was undeniable. Exhausted sailors collapsed in passageways, still clutching empty buckets, a pyramid of battered containers stacked on the deck, and most convincingly, a previously flooded compartment now dry and functional. The young sailor who'd proposed the idea, still nameless in official reports, still just another enlisted man in a crew of thousands, found himself surrounded by shipmates offering cigarettes, coffee, and backslaps that nearly knocked him over. He was too exhausted to properly register the attention, too drained to feel proud. He'd simply seen a problem and proposed a solution. That it worked felt less like genius and more like desperate luck. But luck or brilliance, it had been enough. By the 2-hour mark, Captain Hall convened his senior officers to assess Enterprise's condition. The carrier had survived, though at terrible cost. 14 dead, 68 wounded, major structural damage, and weeks of repairs ahead. But she floated. Her engines ran. Her crew remained aboard, alive and victorious, not over an enemy, but over chaos itself. Hall's after-action report would eventually detail the technical aspects of damage control, the system's failures and workarounds, the timeline of crisis and recovery. But in that moment, standing in a smoke-stained wardroom, he simply said what every officer was thinking. "Gentlemen, we were minutes from losing this ship. A bucket brigade saved us. I don't know whether to be proud or embarrassed, but I know we're still here." Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned. They'd all seen too much to doubt the impossible anymore. Enterprise limped away from Okinawa under her own power, trailing a thin plume of smoke visible for miles. The official casualty report logged 14 men killed in action and 68 wounded, numbers that seemed almost merciful given the devastation. But behind those statistics lay individual tragedies. A radio man from Ohio who'd survived 2 years of combat, only to die in his bunk from the initial blast, a firefighter from Tennessee overcome by smoke while battling flames in the hangar bay, a young aviation mechanic crushed by shifting equipment. Their names were read aloud at a memorial service held on the damaged flight deck 3 days later, their bodies committed to the sea they'd fought to stay above. The wounded filled Enterprise's medical spaces beyond capacity. Burns dominated the injury list, men whose skin had been seared by flaming aviation fuel or scalded by superheated steam from ruptured pipes. Dr. James Furman, the ship's senior medical officer, worked 40 consecutive hours, treating injuries ranging from minor lacerations to traumatic amputations. Several sailors who'd manned the bucket brigade were treated for severe exhaustion, dehydration, and muscle injuries from the sustained physical effort. One collapsed completely, his body simply shutting down after lifting hundreds of 42-pound buckets. He was just desperate enough to think differently and brave enough to speak up when his idea would likely be rejected. That courage, the willingness to propose the unconventional when convention has failed, saved Enterprise as surely as any bomb or torpedo could have destroyed her. The broader lesson extends far beyond naval warfare. Organizations, whether military or civilian, face a constant tension between standardization and flexibility. Procedures exist for good reasons. They capture accumulated wisdom, ensure consistency, and prevent chaos. But procedures assume normal conditions. When circumstances exceed the boundaries of normal, rigid adherence to protocol becomes a death sentence. The genius of Enterprise's survival lay not in abandoning doctrine entirely, but in recognizing when doctrine no longer applied. That recognition requires empowering people at every level to think critically, to question assumptions, and to innovate when innovation becomes necessary for survival. The thin line between victory and disaster haunts every military engagement. But carrier warfare made that line visible in ways that ground combat rarely did. Enterprise's survival margin measured in inches of water, in minutes before systems failed catastrophically, in the exhaustion levels of sailors lifting buckets. Shift any variable slightly if the Kamikaze had struck 20 feet to port, if the sailor had remained silent, if Lieutenant Morrison had rejected the idea completely. And Enterprise joins the honored dead on the ocean floor. Naval warfare offered no second chances, no strategic depth, no room for error. You saved your ship or you drowned. That brutal clarity focused minds wonderfully. Today, Enterprise rests not in a museum, but in the scattered steel of a scrapyard, melted down and repurposed decades ago. But the story persists because it speaks to something timeless about human resilience under pressure. We live in an age of unprecedented technological sophistication, where artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and advanced engineering promise solutions to problems that once required human sweat and determination. Yet, the fundamental truth remains. When systems fail, and they always eventually fail, human initiative becomes irreplaceable. The sailors who saved Enterprise didn't have better tools. They had something more valuable: the refusal to quit when quitting seemed rational. This story belongs to a generation that's rapidly leaving us. The youngest World War II veterans are now centenarians, their first-hand accounts fading into history. But their experiences, the terror, the courage, the improvisation, the stubborn determination to survive, deserve preservation not as dusty historical facts, but as living lessons about human capability under extreme pressure. These weren't superhuman heroes. They were ordinary people who discovered extraordinary strength when circumstances demanded it. That's why their stories matter. That's why we must remember them. If your grandfather, your great-uncle, your neighbor served in World War II. Ask them about their experiences before those memories are lost forever. Record their voices. Write down their stories. Share them with younger generations who need to understand that the freedom they enjoy was purchased through sacrifice, ingenuity, and countless acts of courage that never made headlines. And if you encounter problems that seem unsolvable, remember the young sailor who looked at a flooding carrier and thought, "What about buckets?" Sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones. Sometimes idiotic ideas become heroic actions. And sometimes ordinary people, pushed to their absolute limits, discover they're capable of extraordinary things. That's not just history. That's human nature. And it's a legacy worth preserving, one story at a time.